right. Hello to folks on Zoom. Hello to folks in person. All right, it's gonna take me a minute to get set up here. And then we'll go ahead and start rolling. So today what we're gonna do is finish our lecture on victims. And then there's an activity I'll have y'all do, and then we'll kind of see where we are after that. My guess is that'll probably be our whole agenda for today. Okay. Maybe I'm just gonna figure out where we were here. There we go. Okay. I will share screen for our Zoom folks. Ready? And thanks for bearing with me. I was trying to get something done in my office and it just wasn't happening. So. Okay. There we go. All right, and so I apologize for that's not ideal in terms of staying awake, so. Alrighty, so we had been talking about battered spouses, domestic violence, essentially. So what we're gonna do, and I'm just gonna start walking off because I'm gonna open the blinds to try to get a little more light in here at least. Is talk about this syndrome that was created, manufactured, to try to explain why individuals who are abused, and in particular women, sometimes snap and kill their partners, even when the partner is not actively abusing them. So, some basic stats here. That 1.3 million women each year are beaten by significant others. So, this is something that's been going on, unfortunately, for quite some time. 25% of all women will be abused at some point in their lives in a relationship. And as we mentioned last time, this may be inaccurate due to underreporting. A lot of people do not report. And actually, I realized I went over this slide last time, so I'm going to go ahead to the next one. Okay, so Lenore Walker is a psychologist who studied these women in particular who had been abused and was trying to figure out why do they just kill their abusers out of the blue sometimes. Oftentimes when the abuser is sleeping, again, not actively abusing them. And so what she did is she looked at existing psychological theories and drew from the theory of learned helplessness. So this is something that Martin Seligman came up with. If you're not familiar with him, he did a lot of research about depression. And he did experiments on dogs to test this. And so basically he put dogs in this sort of double-sided cage and he would apply electric shock, not a much to hurt the dog, but enough to like be tingly and annoying. And most of the time, they're in this cage and there's this short wall and the dog can just hop over to the other side, doesn't have to have the tingling, good to go. Well, what he did in some of the cases is he took this existing double cage and he put a wall all the way to the top. So now these dogs couldn't hop over it and they were kind of stuck with this annoying tingly electric shock. And what they learned is that those dogs would eventually just sort of like lay down and take it. And even if you remove that wall all the way to the top, they still would try to get out. So the idea was this also applies to people. People who are depressed won't necessarily seek out things that will actually help them. And that people who, have supports, things along those lines might do better, might realize they can escape. And what Walker argued in her 1979 book was that the strict gender roles in our society teach women that they have no control over their own lives, thus creating a similar experience of learned helplessness to Seligman's dogs that could not escape the shock. She argued that society's gender roles teach women that there is no escape, that they must be reliant on their partners. And that this is made worse when someone is abused, that they really feel helpless and like there's no way to get out. She also came up with this idea of the cycle of violence. Phase one is tension building. So this is where there's some fighting, potentially less severe abuse. And the woman will start to withdraw from everyone else around her. Phase two is acute battering. This is the discharge of tension, often the partner being abused. Again, in Walker's case, she was using women as the example, is injured. And then phase three is contrition, where they're really apologetic. If the woman has filed any charges, she typically drops them. And the cycle kind of starts over again. And it's what Walker argued is it's largely because of phase three that they stick around, right? Because then the person's saying they're really sorry and they're trying to support them. And so they're like, oh, okay, they do love me. So in 1984, she published a book called The Battered Woman Syndrome. And it had some data in it that she had collected. The most significant predictor of battering was past violence on the part of the batterer. So this goes what we've been talking about all semester, that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. People kind of tend to keep doing what they've been doing. Verbal abuse accompanied physical abuse in over 80% of the battering incidents reported by women in her study. Only 2/3 of the women who needed medical attention after being battered actually sought out medical assistance. 1/5 of women needed medical assistance after the first battering incident. So people will be like, oh, it'll start out, so it's fine. But some of them were that violent. Approximately half of the people who were abused needed medical assistance after the worst incident. What Walker started to find is it seems like battered women sort of train themselves to have higher levels of pain tolerance. And she said this is consistent with the idea of women dissociating during the phase two battering incident. And she argues that women's dissociation from their physical bodies may lead to distancing themselves from this pain. Psychological abuse is a big part of what people who are battered experience. They report being subject to all 8 forms of psychological abuse laid out by Amnesty International in their description of psychological torture used on prisoners of war. All 8. And these areas of abuse include victim isolation, creating exhaustion, and you do that by limiting food, interrupting sleep, things along those lines. monopolizing the victim's perceptions through obsessiveness or possessiveness, threats of death to the victim and or to those close around her, degradation, forced drug or alcohol administration, use of hypnotic states to produce altered states of consciousness, and occasional indulgences that give the victim hope, which again is that phase 3. So again, these are all things used on prisoners of war, and they're used in abusive relationships. Walker also argued that her study supported this learned helplessness component of her theory, in that the woman reported becoming less active and more passive as a way of coping. Sort of like, if I don't argue, if I just kind of hang back and try to stay under the radar, I might be less likely to be physically abused. 3/4 of the women she surveyed believed that their batterer would kill them. So again, imagine living with that every day. And she also found that the battered women had high levels of depression. There was some other research support here. So Gleason in 1993 found that battered women are more likely to be depressed, to experience psychosexual dysfunction, and to exhibit symptoms of both generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD. Arnon and Sagi, who knows, 1995, battered women were more likely to tolerate violence in their marriage and blame themselves for that violence. These women were controlled by their husbands, were less happy, and were more nervous than women who were not battered. I mean, that one just seems like obvious to us, right? Dutton and Painter in 1993 showed evidence for 3 aspects they considered essential to battered women syndrome: low self-esteem, high rates of PTSD symptoms, and a paradoxical attachment to the batterer in spite of the abuse. So again, sort of that phase 3, creating that attachment. They found that a battered woman syndrome composite score that they made up of these 3 areas, the self-esteem, PTSD symptoms, and attachment to the batterer, accounted for by the intermittency of the abuse. So this means they never knew when the abuse was coming. We know just from basic models of learning that this is like the most difficult for people to handle, or animals for that matter. The total amount of physical abuse, the emotional abuse that was going on, and the power shifting as the person who's being abused loses control and the person who's doing the abusing gains it. So this idea of battered woman syndrome has been used in court. And again, this is why Walker developed it, because she thought we need a way to explain to judges and juries why an abused woman might seem to, like, out of nowhere kill her husband. And so it has been used in court cases. It can be helpful because before it was developed, they just believed that women who were abused, these battered women, were severely psychologically damaged. That there was something about the woman that, like, caused the person to abuse her. It's horrific to think about. It removes the responsibility from the woman and dispels myths about battering. And Schuler in 1992 looked at if mock juries heard evidence about battered woman syndrome, how did that affect their decisions? So there was one where they gave no expert witness. There was one where they gave a general expert witness who just sort of talked about abuse in general. And then there's one where they had an expert specifically testify about battered woman syndrome. And those who heard that specific expert who heard about battered woman syndrome were more likely to reduce the charge on the woman. So for example, if it was in a state with the death penalty, they might instead give them life or a shorter sentence. They're also more likely to believe that the woman was abused and feared for her life when they heard specific testimony about battered woman syndrome. maybe not surprisingly, because this is what we do in science, there's criticism of this construct. So in 1996, Gordon wrote that battered woman syndrome is an inadequate term to represent the scientific and clinical knowledge concerning battering and its effects. And there's been a critique of using the concept of learned helplessness. So Seligman adapted his theory to make it apply to humans. He didn't just take the dog concept and be like, yep, that applies to humans. He like fleshed it out more, theorized it more. And Walker admits she did not use the human version when she was developing battered woman syndrome. There is some concern, for example, of how this might play out and maybe even perpetuate myths. So for example, here's a quote: "The emphasis on learned helplessness created a stereotype of passivity that obscures the reality of women's active strategies for help seeking and survival." And in 2003, Ferraro, sorry, I'm not sure what just happened to our captions. Try that again. Ferraro cited examples where women's cases have been hurt by the use of battered woman syndrome because the woman in court might not fit the stereotypical sort of passive ideal. There are abused women who are outgoing, assertive, and strong, and still can't get out of those scenarios, right? Ferraro also argues that the battered woman syndrome construct has prevented many of those women from using a self-defense argument, and also that it has stopped triers of fact, whether those are judges or juries, from believing that women were even abused if they did not exhibit these characteristic passive traits. And if we go back to our discussion last week, this is very much something like manipulated by lawyers. So we talked about how R. Kelly's lawyer would be like, these women aren't acting like victims because they're standing up for themselves, right? So that can certainly get in the way. Unfortunately, it isn't necessarily fully supported by the literature either. So for example, if we just look at the cycle of violence, and I thought for sure I had some slides about this. Yeah, here we go. I just accidentally went forward one. So in the cycle of violence, only 65% of the people they looked at showed phase 1. And only 58% showed that like conciliatory phase that's supposed to be so vital to this. And that was in Walker's own data. So it wasn't like they collected new data. This was the data she based the theory on. And as we just mentioned, it's probably the intermittency of the abuse, the fact that like you never know when it's coming rather than the cycle. And Gordon argued that this diagnosis is not necessary. And I mean, like, part of the problem is the idea that it's like framed as a diagnosis or a syndrome, right? The definition of a syndrome is a pathological condition that has certain signs and symptoms. So this pathologizes battered women, which was what it was like trying not to do, right? It characterizes them as dysfunctional rather than the batterer. Hempel in 2004 emphasized that the term syndrome implies a disease, pathology, or some sort of mental illness or defect. And it pointed out 2 problems with using battered women syndrome to describe abused women. The first is that a syndrome implies that as the result of the battering, the woman in question suffers from a disease or a mental defect. And second, battered women syndrome can be interpreted such that it appears women who have it are predisposed to be in an abusive relationship. That's not what it's supposed to be saying at all, but because this like syndrome terminology is used, some people interpret it that way. And in many cases, most cases, neither assumption is accurate. And it can be seen as clinical jargon that can confuse juries or judges. There were also problems with Walker's original study, methodological issues. She had no control group, so she asked the same women to report both on their current abusive relationship and past non-abusive relationships, or vice versa. So there's certainly like a recall bias there, right? There was a sampling bias. So the women she interviewed were women in domestic violence shelters, but they were women who came to the shelter of their own volition. They tended to be middle-class women who had the resources to leave, and they left their relationships after a moderate level of violence. So they're likely not fully representing the gamut of the experiences of women who are abused. There are discrepancies in the data in her book in 1984. So for example, there are different numbers in the text of the book versus in the tables and figures. That's problematic. And she does make assertions that are not based on the data. So for example, she argues that batterers often have a strict father and an inconsistent mother. But in the next sentence, she states, although we did not collect such data, it's reasonable to speculate that if we had, and then goes on to make a statement related to this non-existent data. This is something that if, she published a book, that's often just like an editor goes through and looks for readability and typos and things like that. If this had been peer reviewed, which is the process by which you sort of anonymously review things by experts in the field, someone would have called her out on it and been like, you can't say that, you don't have the data to back it up, right? In terms of its use in court, it can reinforce these negative myths by focusing on passivity and timidity. In 1992, Schuler looked and said that experts groups see the defendant as less in control of her own actions and see the woman as pathological when a battered woman syndrome argument is used. Dutton in 1996, said that this battered woman syndrome is not only inadequate as a term, but that it can potentially mislead the fact finder, whether that's the judge or the jury. It does not help in explaining reasonableness of someone's actions. And so Ferraro in 2003 argued that it's probably better to testify about like battering and its effects rather than use the term battered woman syndrome. So what should psychologists do? When do they get involved, first of all? So oftentimes it's when the battered woman has killed her husband. And again, I'm using woman and husband just because unfortunately women in the States in particular are at a much higher risk, but I want to fully acknowledge that people of any gender can abuse anyone of any other gender or the same gender. So fully acknowledging this, but again, this whole construct was kind of developed based on the fact that unfortunately female identifying people are abused more. So also duress, psychologists will get involved. So sometimes the woman who's being abused will commit crimes, drug trafficking, other things, under the orders of her abuser. And so psychologists might get involved then. And then child custody cases. Again, unfortunately, our society has really backwards ideas. And rather than being like, maybe we shouldn't put the kids with someone who's been abusing their mother, they'll blame the mother and be like, why couldn't you protect the kids? Why didn't you leave? Things like that. Rather than being like, why were you abusing the mom and or the kids, right? And so you might look at why the mother couldn't protect them. Sometimes she is ordered to abuse the children by the abuser. And why having PTSD or battered women syndrome doesn't preclude her from being a good mother. Unfortunately, sometimes even people who are getting help for psychological issues, which I think in here we can all acknowledge is a really good thing, right? are seen as an unfit parent because they have a psychological diagnosis. We all know that's not true. We need to explain that to the triers of fact. So psychologists, like in other types of cases, may be called on to do evaluations here. Like other types of cases, you need to be familiar with the laws in your jurisdiction. What legal questions do you need to consider? You need to know the current literature on domestic violence, battered woman syndrome, things along those lines. And so the time needed to do these, different people have different ideas. So Walker said that you should allot at least 30 hours for the interview and the record review. And someone who did research in 2004 said it's maybe like more like 6 to 20 hours, but still you should plan to dedicate a lot of time to this. In terms of the interviews, you're going to want to interview the victim. You're also going to want to interview witnesses, those close to her, like friends and family, coworkers. And then record review. You want to look at the police records, medical records, any personal correspondences. People are really dumb in this. Like, I hate to say this, but they'll text and email abusive stuff, right? And we'll never think maybe this would be used against me in a court of law. So oftentimes the victim has a record, or even if she doesn't have, a chain of texts or emails, she might have started documenting what was happening to her. Now, in terms of testimony, again, it's unclear whether battered women syndrome information might be helpful or might actually be more confusing. But modern thoughts say it's much more important to look at the individual woman's specific symptoms than a general discussion of, PTSD, battered woman syndrome, what have you, that might not apply. Judges, attorneys, expert witnesses, and advocates for battered women all agree that battered women syndrome does not include all of the info necessary to help the trier of fact, but general expert testimony on battering and its effects can be helpful. So conclusions here, although this idea of a battered woman syndrome was really helpful when Walker first came up with it, we've kind of moved past it. It's dated. Again, just the idea that it's battered women syndrome, and doesn't acknowledge that people of other genders can be abused, right, as problematic. And it's more important to address general aspects of battering and its effects as they apply to the person who was abused. Alrighty, so now we're going to briefly talk about sexual harassment. So sexual harassment is obviously much more of a workplace issue, but that doesn't make it less of a legal issue, obviously. So this can be both criminal and civil in terms of things. And Jasmine shares, I had a friend who dealt with spouse abuse, and he had a tendency to threaten her over the phone. So she learned to record the conversations and text messages. Yeah, then it's crazy how comfortable they'll get. Yeah, and some people, especially with voice notes on your phone, right? People are finding it easier to record arguments and things like that too. Obviously, the victim needs to be super careful, because if the abuser finds out they're recording them, that can potentially be more dangerous for them. But technology helps with that. I mean, just to give you an idea of how far we've come, when I was in college from 2000 to 2004, I worked for our school paper, our equivalent of the Marlin Chronicle. And when I interviewed people, I had this little device called a dictaphone, and it had little tiny tapes, cassette tapes. And I would take that and I would record and then transcribe based on that. Now I could just do it on my phone, right? And with AI, and we're not even talking ChatGPT, we're talking about the captions that are coming up right here, right? There are programs that can translate that for you. So technology has come leaps and bounds, and will continue to come leaps and bounds, and that can be really helpful. All right, so sexual harassment. Unfortunately, this is fairly prevalent. So in 1992, a survey of 20,000 federal employees found that 42% of female workers reported being sexually harassed on the job during the previous 2 years. And again, people of all genders experience sexual harassment. And interestingly, it's often men who are doing the harassing, regardless of the gender of the person being harassed. So how do we define sexual harassment? There we go. So it's unwanted sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. And these make up or constitute harassment under a few conditions. One is that submission to such conduct is essentially made a term of or a condition of employment. And sometimes people will explicitly say that, and sometimes it will just be implied. Submission or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as the basis for employment decisions affecting that individual. So raises, promotions, things along those lines. Or I should say, when such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. And the courts, following guidelines developed by the Equal Employment Opportunity Center, EEOC, have recognized 2 types of sexual harassment. The first, I think, is the one we tend to think of when we think of sexual harassment, and that's the quid pro quo. And this is an implicit or explicit bargain in which the harasser promises a reward or threatens punishment depending on the victim's response. So you'll be hired, you'll get a raise, you'll get a promotion, you'll keep your job as long as you engage in this sexual behavior with me. Hostile workplace harassment involves demeaning comments, acts of touching or attempted intimacy, or the display of provocative photographs or artwork. So, gosh, it's probably like my first year here. So 13 years ago, I had our then head of HR come and talk to one of my classes about harassment. And she used examples from just like other places in Virginia. Luckily, she did not have examples from Wesleyan at that point in time. I don't know if there are now or not. But one example was there was a place where like the men all hung up naked calendars of women. And so all the female employees felt really uncomfortable. Another one, there was a small company and they had a kissing club. If you were a female employee, you had to kiss the boss in order to like keep your job. So it doesn't have to be, you know, sort of what we would think of intercourse or other types of sexual behavior. It can be things like that. To determine which types of harassment claims succeed, in 1988, they looked at 81 charges and they found that sexual harassment charges were more likely to be resolved in favor of the person who was being harassed when the harassing behaviors were more serious. So again, perhaps going to sexual assault, things along those lines. When the complainant had witnesses to support the charges, and when the complainant had given notice to the management prior to filing former charges. And so this is why people always say, like, go to management, go to HR to report things. Now, let's say you're in a small company like the Kissing Club, that becomes really problematic because the person you would complain to is the person who's harassing you, right? And there's probably not an HR there. So that gets tricky. But this is also why one of the people I follow on Instagram is actually an employment lawyer. And one of the pieces of advice he gives over and over and over, regardless if you're going for like a harassment charge or just talking about terms of employment, is to always communicate in writing. So like send HR an email and make them email you back. Because they'll try to say stuff on the phone or make you meet in person so that there's no written record. But if you have a written record, then you could be like, look, I reported it on this day and I either got no response or this was the sort of like unhelpful response that I got. This is obviously a big issue and can lead to people not feeling comfortable, people not keeping their jobs. So it's an extreme form, obviously, of sexual harassment, but some folks will include sexual assault at work, the workplace, and an umbrella of sexual harassment. And several of the military sexual trauma veterans I worked with had been sexually assaulted by their supervisor at their place of work, so like in an office building or something like that. And that obviously can be very harmful. And so some of these women left what would probably have been a lucrative career in the military, right? Didn't get those 20 years, didn't get the pension and all the other retirement benefits because of that. And so sometimes these lawsuits related to sexual harassment will acknowledge that, lost wages, lost opportunities. All righty, so we trucked all the way through that. Oh, that's why it acted up. For some reason, it randomly signed me out of everything. You gotta love Google just being moody sometimes. Okay, so if it lets me go back in, here we go. Then I can show you guys the assignment, but it's on Blackboard for those of you who have your laptops open under assignments, and it's assignment 9. There, nope, that's definitely my password. Oh no. Okay, let me email you the link in just a second here. I wonder if you're having the same problem. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Assignment 9. It should be assignment 9. Because assignment 10 is the one we'll do next Tuesday. Just a reminder while I'm doing this that there's no class on Thursday. It is the academic symposium. Some of you may be presenting. Recommend the rest of you go and support your fellow folks. I plan to use part of the day to catch up on grading, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, again, no class on Thursday. Then our last class is on a week from today. And we'll talk about prisons and prison systems. And then on our scheduled exam time will be when you all do your presentations about the service learning project. Alrighty, so yeah, Haley, just make sure you're in a group with somebody who has access, I guess. Actually, okay, do you all have access? Everybody else? Okay, cool. Actually, since there's only 5 of y'all here, let's just make you all one group. And then I'll see how many people are on Zoom. And so yeah, the assignments, again, this projector is awful, but it should look like this. It might take a little longer than usual because there are several links you do need to read, but we have the whole rest of the class for y'all to work on this. Zoom folks, looks like there's enough of you that I'll put you into 2 groups. So I'm going to go ahead and stop share and create 2 breakout rooms and go ahead and work through all the questions together. And again, there are links to click out to read articles in some of the cases, I think all the cases. And then maybe in like 20 minutes or so, I'll bring y'all back so we can chat through everything. All right, the room should be opening. And I'm going to turn the light on. I'll connect with see what the background. There. Yeah. I think that's true, because I think I remember there was a. When I was kind of down the meeting, to try to okay, good. That's okay, I'm going to post the link and I was like, but yeah, because I remember very clearly there was this CNN reporter who was like, this is gonna ruin these young men's lives, and I was like, but what about the victim? I mean, it has been described as the most violent crime you can survive. Alrighty. Give y'all a few more minutes. It looks like folks here in the room are doing great, almost done. One of the groups online looks like they need a little more time, but then we'll start talking about it. Okie dokie. All right, I'm gonna bring back our Zoom folks and then we'll talk through this. Alrighty, welcome back, everybody. And we're just gonna chat through everybody's responses. And so let me see. Group 2, which was Karen, Adriana, Aaliyah, and Sadie. Can one of you read or share your answer to the first question? And if no one can unmute, I can do it. Okay. I think everybody's kind of in a place where they can't unmute. But they said, I strongly disagree with the judge's verdict. So this is the one from Canada. There's this reasoning for the verdict was ridiculous and he ignored the victim along with her trauma when he delivered the verdict. It's sad to say that I've heard people talk about how when women dress the way they do, quote unquote, they're asking for it. That statement alone enrages me because what a woman wears does not display her consent in these situations. The situation makes other victims not come forward because they feel as if they will be treated the same way, and the rapist will go free. Yeah. Alrighty. And for our in-class folks, if y'all can discuss your response to the question about Steubenville.
I basically said like I agree regarding, I think it's kind of weird that I think it says like the mother, like of the victim was saying that she took pain, and the two that were convicted. I thought that was kind of weird. And I said that in reference to the psychology of the victims, like I think that the main issue, in my opinion, is that people place too much attention on the suspect. And I think it kind of takes away from the victims and like what they went through, like just the whole thing and like asking like her, like did she remember anything? And it's like I kind of understand because it has been cases where like women, like where men have been falsely accused of rape. So at the same time, like I understand why they ask so many questions. But at the same time, I feel like in some places it's just like kind of self-explanatory. Like she was 16 and she was drunk and she went black out and she didn't remember. Right. You cannot give your consent if you don't remember. And so yeah, I feel like just overall, like it just places too much attention on like the suspects and it kind of takes away from the victim and everything that they went through, especially when they have like a high profile, like in this case, like they're athletes. And athletes, they always get looked at like athletes or like rappers or like anybody with any type of like with any type of social status, like they're not looked at like regular human beings. They're like, oh, it's no way he could have did that. Like, oh, he plays football. Like they're regular human beings just like everybody else. So I feel like especially when they have a higher profile, like it just takes away from the victim and everything that they went through. And I think in a way it kind of makes it more traumatizing.
Yeah, and that certainly I think applies to people of any gender, right? Who kind of get away with stuff. I was thinking about like, I don't even know if people are aware of this, but like Caitlyn Jenner hit someone with her car and killed them and like just brushed under the rug. And I mean, there are multiple celebrities that's happened to. There's Kennedy who did that. I think it was Ted Kennedy killed someone in a drunk driving accident, just swept under the rug. It's like there are different sets of rules, like you're saying, if you're famous or have money versus like the rest of us.
Never do that.
Yeah, it's scary. And again, not the only celebrity. I think there are several, like Lindsay Lohan hit someone with her car too. I don't think she killed them, but like, yeah, it's just like different sets of rules. Alrighty, and so we talked a little bit about the VWC case last week. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through the people who were able to answer that. Yeah, alcohol tends to be an issue, problems with the environment where the cases happen. The situation wasn't properly reported. Yeah, I mean, she was my advisee and I didn't know until 6 months after it happened. I mean, she was under no obligation to talk to me, obviously, but it was still like heartbreaking, right? Yeah, Julia, go ahead.
So the case that I looked at question 2, and they spoke about how like it depends what state you're in as like what they classify as rape.
Yeah.
So would that be like where the act took place? Like would that be the laws they follow, or where would it be like where they went to court? Like how is that
Good
decided?
question. Yeah, it should in theory be where the act took place, right? But sometimes jurisdiction will be moved for a whole host of reasons. So you think people are going to be too biased. Like the R. Kelly case, I keep coming back to because I just watched this documentary. So sorry for those of you who are sick of me talking about R. Kelly, but like they tried him in New York for the racketeering charges just because like New York was the only one who had a law about that. But yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, it can be where the case is, especially if it's federal, but typically it is the jurisdiction where the crime took place. So yeah, that can be really difficult too, right? Because like, in theory, something that is considered sexual assault in one place might not in the other. Yeah. Yeah, and the Jane Doe case was really sad because she did everything right. I don't think the article sort of sketches over it, but like, she was the one who walked her friends home. And she just happened to be the last one. And this guy took advantage of that, which was really unfortunate. I hope she's doing well. I haven't been in touch with her, so. And then we have the proposal by a Georgia lawmaker to bring sexual assault charges. These people would be accusers, not victims. And I'll just sort of open this one up to anybody. Sort of, what do you all think of this idea of classifying sexual assault victims as accusers, but not doing that with any other crime?
You said classifying. Oh, not talking about.
No, to everybody, yeah. Okay, so the last question is, and Jasmine, I'll get to you in just a sec, because I think Jasmine has an answer. So a few years back, there was a lawmaker in Georgia who said, let's make a law that sexual assault victims will be classified as accusers, not victims. Because they're just, again, like assuming they're lying, even though it's only 2 to 8% of the cases like any other crime. Go ahead, Jasmine. If you're there.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Sorry, my dogs were getting a little too rowdy. I wanted to answer this one. Where is
And-
it? Oh, yeah.
Sorry, were
I
you
put-
group 3, group 1? Sorry, trying to remember.
I put it under, I think group 1, because
Okay.
I didn't know. Yeah.
That's
So
okay.
I put that the amount of coverage that fake rape cases receive, I think is insane over the actual amount of victimization from sexual assault. Now, there are cases where there are fake rape accusations, but the start of this topic has been blown out of proportion to the point of turning it into victim blaming or not believing the victim. And now legislation is being proposed to even further victimize or traumatize the sexual assault survivors. And I think there should be new methods to convict false rape accusers, but labeling victims as accusers may cause more damage than good.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit it on the head that like, if we're gonna do that for rape, let's do it for every crime, right? Like, just make everything the same. So yeah, and it's just. Again, it goes with myths, right? Which is why some people are really hesitant about battered woman syndrome, because it also can like perpetuate myths that like those who have been abused are weak, et cetera, et cetera. I know someone who's going through a case where they are dealing with a childhood sexual abuser, and their lawyer told them, don't do extra stuff right now. If we're arguing that you were psychologically impacted on this, it should basically seem like you're barely getting by. And so like, this is someone who's years out from what they went through, right? But because of like how people perceive survivors as like needing to be weak in order to get compensation, or, you know, for criminal charges to be, I forget if it's a lawsuit or a criminal case. It's probably a lawsuit because the statute of limitations is probably done, unfortunately. But like, they have to act weaker, which is mind-boggling.
I think the reason why they look at sexual assault, well, why they're trying to like change it from like a victim to an accuser, is honestly mainly because the majority of the time, people that are accusing someone of sexual assault or rape is them. And I say it all the time that women are like the most disrespected people in the entire world. Like, we get treated like almost nothing, like from the majority of the people in this world. So it's like, if a woman says anything, it's always frowned upon, like, cause I just don't, I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but that's just basically how I feel. I feel like the only reason why they're saying that is because most of the time, the people accusing of somebody else of raping them is a woman. And a lot of people, like a lot of higher up people, do not have respect for women. Like, but they never have though. Like,
Even the women in power.
Yeah,
unfortunately,
like
get sucked in.
even Donald Trump, like, I was talking to somebody, and they were telling me about the professor here that
Oh, yeah.
fired a couple years ago, that went on social media and basically saying how, like, if you're a woman or whatever. Not if you're a woman, but basically like if you voted for Joe
Yeah.
Biden, then you're like, you're not a Christian, basically.
He basically said, if you voted for Biden, don't even talk to me.
Yeah,
he said, we like, didn't even have a conversation.
Yeah.
yeah, but I heard he said.
Which like is a valid opinion to hold, but not if you're a public figure who's going to be, that would be like me saying like, if you voted for Trump, don't come talk to me. Like during the Trump election, one of my favorite students, who was a WGS student, voted for Trump, and I just told her, you're an enigma. I don't really understand you, but good for you, right? Like, it's your right. Yeah, and so like, obviously, you should just.
But Trump support, he support sexual thought. So it's like for a professor to say like, oh, you can't be a Christian if you vote for Joe Biden. But the man that you voted for, like, supports sexual thought and supports like domestic violence, but that is all stuff that was like. Basically like in the Bible, like in Christianity, like way back in the 1800s, so that's why I'm saying like. Women were never meant to even have an opinion to even be able to tell somebody that they were raped. Like a lot of conservative or like traditional people, they don't even feel like that's a thing, like a woman could be raped, because they don't feel like women are supposed to have their own rights and their own opinions. They don't feel like a woman should have the opportunity to say yes or no. So it's just like.
Well, yeah, and it's, again, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a religious studies professor, fully putting that out there, but my understanding. No, I'm just saying, like,
I'm in a history class right
Oh,
now,
nice.
so I'm learning a lot about like the history of Christianity.
yeah, well, and I was just gonna say, like, people interpret the Bible in very different ways. So for example, folks who are of the Jewish faith read the same Old Testament, but interpret a lot of it very differently than modern day Christians, for example. Like one of the things that's been really interesting to me throughout the like abortion debates is Jewish individuals say, by our religion, it is our right. There's a part of the Old Testament that says like, if the fetus is gonna kill the woman has a right to the abortion. In fact, you must give her an abortion.
The Bible doesn't say anything in this.
But
It
and
actually
people
doesn't.
interpret it different ways, right?
That's about men, like, sexualize a woman, and it's like, if you do something, so shall like, what, eyes out or something like that, and I'm like.
Yeah, okay, fully disclosing, I'm not a religious studies professor, this is mostly me reading and watching videos of people talking about things. But yeah, it's just something to kind of keep in mind whenever you see something. Or someone's referencing religion, right? Or just saying these people are less than for any reason. Question it, right? Question it. And question, like Sydney was saying, who's making the laws, right? And like, are the laws they're making benefiting them, right? I think about the fact that like Congress won't vote to increase the minimum wage, but they always give themselves raises. Like, this is the one thing my very conservative father and I can agree on is that like, unfortunately, a lot of people in the government are corrupt, regardless of their political party, right? Because power can corrupt. And so there are people who do, and there are people who are fighting for that not to happen on both sides of the aisle, right? And so like, that's been a challenge for me, is to recognize that there are people who I might not agree with on a lot of things, but who you can listen to on other issues, right? So yeah, excellent conversation. Love this. And this is actually going to play a lot into our conversation next Tuesday in terms of like, who creates the prisons, who's in charge of them, how do they affect people psychologically? So. All right, thanks everyone on Zoom as well.